The wounded stranger had been lying in the ditch beside the Lodgepole road for the better part of a day, shot, robbed, and left for dead, and a fair number of folks had ridden past him in that time. They saw the blood and the stillness, and they kept their eyes on the road ahead, afraid of trouble, suspicious he was some outlaw who'd gotten what he had coming. Every last respectable soul who passed that day rode on by, and then a lonely widow named Abigail Dyer came along in her old cart, and she was the only one in the whole county who stopped. Abigail Dyer was a woman the world had long since stopped noticing. She'd been a widow 11 years, alone on a small hardscrabble place at the edge of the Sweetwater country, and somewhere in those 11 years she had become invisible the way solitary older women so often do. Not disliked, exactly, just forgotten, overlooked, a quiet plain widow. Nobody thought much about one way or the other. The town of Antelope barely registered her existence. She had no children, no family near, no one who needed her or waited for her or noticed whether she came or went. She did her trading, kept to herself, and went home to an empty house, and the great ache of her life was not poverty or hardship which she could bear, but the simple, crushing loneliness of being a person with a great deal of love in her and no living soul to give it to. 11 years of it. She had near forgotten the sound of her own voice, used for anything but talking to her chickens. So perhaps it took a lonely person to stop for a stranger that day. Perhaps the same world that had taught the respectable folks of Antelope to ride on past their own kind had never gotten around to teaching Abigail Dyer the lesson, because nobody had bothered to teach her much of anything in 11 invisible years. Whatever the reason, when she came along the Lodgepole road in her cart and saw the man crumpled bloody in the ditch where the others had left him, Abigail Dyer did not ride on. She climbed down, a small graying woman, not strong, and she knelt in the dirt beside a stranger she'd never seen. And she found that against all the odds he was still breathing. He was a big man, and badly hurt, shot through the side and beaten besides, and so far gone from blood loss and a day in the sun that she truly thought he'd die before she got him anywhere. But Abigail Dyer was more stubborn than she was strong, and she got that big wounded stranger up out of the ditch and into her cart somehow, an inch at a time, talking to him the whole while though he couldn't hear her. And she drove him home to her little place and dragged him into her own bed, and she set about the work of trying to keep a dying stranger alive. It was not easy, and for 3 days it was not at all certain. She cleaned and bound the wound as best a woman with no doctoring, but a hard life worth could. She fought the fever that came, sitting up with him through the nights, cooling him, dribbling water and broth between his cracked lips, doing the 1,000 small desperate things a person does to hold another person to the earth. The doctor in Antelope was a day off and disinclined to ride out for a stranger a widow had scraped off the road, so it was just Abigail, alone, willing a man she didn't know to live. And the strangest thing happened in those 3 desperate days. Abigail Dyer, who had been so unbearably lonely for 11 years, was not lonely at all. She had someone to care for. She had a reason to rise in the morning, and a reason to stay up through the night. The great unused store of love in her had somewhere, at last, to go, even if it was only into a dying stranger who didn't know she existed, and it poured out of her like water from a long-stopped spring. On the 3rd night the fever broke, and on the 4th day the stranger opened his eyes. He was confused and weak, and wary the way a hurt man surfacing among strangers is wary, but he was alive, and he was lucid, and the first thing Abigail Dyer did when those eyes opened and found her was burst into tears she couldn't have explained. The tears of a woman who'd held a life in her 2 hands for 3 days and won. "Easy," she said when she could speak. "Easy now, you're safe. You've been bad hurt, but the fever's broke, and I believe you'll mend. You're at my place off the Lodgepole road. I found you in the ditch." "You found me," the man rasped. He looked at her, trying to make sense of it. "Why'd you? Folks don't stop, ma'am." "Not for a bloody stranger in a ditch. I lay there half a day, I heard them. Horses passing. Nobody stopped." His voice cracked. "Why'd you stop?" And Abigail Dyer, the invisible widow, gave him the truest and simplest answer there was. "Because you were a person and you were hurt," she said. "I don't know that there's more to it than that. I couldn't have lived with myself, riding past a man left to die. So I stopped. His name," she learned over the slow days of his mending, "was Ben Quaid, and he was a stranger to the Sweetwater country, just passing through, and there was a hard story behind the bullet in him." Ben had spent 15 years building up a little herd of his own, working another man's range, scrimping toward the dream of his own place at last. That spring he'd finally sold the whole herd. 15 years of work turned to cash money, his entire stake for the fresh start he'd been working toward his whole life. And he'd been carrying that money on the Lodgepole road, heading west to buy land of his own when he was bushwhacked. 2 men, he thought, maybe 3. They'd shot him off his horse, taken every dollar of his 15 years, and left him in the ditch to die, and ridden off with his whole life in their saddlebags. He'd had nothing left in the world but the bullet they'd put in him until a lonely widow stopped where everyone else rode by. 15 years, Ben said, low and bitter, when he told her. Gone, the herd, the money, the place I was going to buy, all of it, in one afternoon on that road. They left me with nothing but a hole in my side. He looked at the small, bare room, the evidence of a poor woman's life, and shame came over his hard face. And here I am, taking the bed and the food of the one person who had less reason than anybody to spare it and more reason to ride on past. I've got nothing to pay you with, ma'am. They took it all. I can't even pay you for saving my life. I didn't stop to be paid, Abigail said. Don't insult us both by talking about pay. You'll stay till you're well, and that's the end of it. The Lord knows the house has been too quiet for 11 years anyhow. It was the 11 years that made Ben Quaid look at her, really look, and begin to see the lonely widow the way no one in Antelope had bothered to in over a decade. For as Ben mended, slow week by slow week, in the little house at the edge of the Sweetwater, the two of them came to know each other in the close quiet way of a sick room and a long convalescence, and Ben Quaid came to understand that the woman who'd saved him was as alone in the world as he now was, and had been for 11 years, and was about the finest, kindest, most overlooked soul he'd ever come across. He saw how she lit up at having someone to cook for, someone to talk to, someone to fuss over. He saw the great unused tenderness in her, and the quiet ache of a good woman the world had simply forgotten to notice. And Abigail, in turn, found in the recovering stranger the first person in over a decade who looked at her when she spoke, who thanked her, who saw her. And the two of them, two solitary people whom the whole world had ridden past in one way or another, slowly became the center of each other's days. The reckoning over the robbery came in time. Ben recovered enough to give a description to the sheriff at Antelope, who, now that the bloody stranger in a ditch had turned out to be an honest robbed drover and not the outlaw everyone had assumed, took a sudden interest. And it turned out the men who'd shot Ben Quaid were known bad characters who'd been seen flush with cash. And the law ran them down and recovered the better part of Ben's stolen money, the 15 years' worth, the whole stake for the fresh start. By the time Ben was well enough to walk Abigail's yard, the sheriff rode out and put into his hands the money he'd thought was gone forever, the price of his herd, the means of the new life he'd been riding toward when the bullet found him, which left Ben Quaid healed and solvent again, free to do exactly what he'd set out to do before the Lodgepole Road, take his money and ride west and buy his own place at last. The dream of 15 years. There was nothing holding him to a poor widow's hard-scrabble farm. His debt of gratitude he could pay any number of ways: money, work, a fond goodbye, and then ride on to the life he'd earned. He came to Abigail on the porch the evening he was strong enough to travel, his recovered money in his saddlebag, and Abigail braced herself because she had known this day would come and had been dreading it the way she dreaded few things. The day the one person who'd filled her empty house would ride west and leave it empty again, and her along with it. I expect you'll be heading on now, she said before he could, trying to be brave about it. West to buy your place. It's what you worked all those years for. You should go, Ben. Don't let an old widow's stopping for you weigh on you. You don't owe me a thing. I told you that from the start." Ben Quaid stood on the porch a long moment, and then he said the thing that changed both their lives. "I've been thinking on it," he said slowly. 15 years I worked for a place of my own, a fresh start out west somewhere among strangers. And the whole time I was lying in that ditch on the Lodgepole Road, listening to the horses ride past. Respectable folks, church-going folks, folks with families and futures, every single one of them looked at a hurt man and decided he wasn't worth the trouble and rode on, every one. He looked at her, and then a woman the world had thrown away, same as it threw me away in that ditch. A woman with less than any of them and more. Reason to pass me by, she stopped. She knelt down in the dirt for a stranger and she pulled me out and she gave me her bed and her food and 3 nights of her life when I couldn't even thank her. His voice roughened. "Abigail, I've been chasing a place of my own for 15 years, thinking that's what would make me whole. And I lay in your bed these weeks and watched the kindest soul I ever met be lonely in her own house, and I figured something out. I don't want a fresh start among strangers. I had everything I was looking for the day you stopped on that road. The place I've been trying to buy my whole life. It's not out west. It's right here on this porch with the only person in the world who ever once thought I was worth stopping for." Abigail Dyer stared at him, hardly daring to understand. "You can't mean to stay," she whispered. "You've your money back, your whole start. You could have anything. A young wife, good land, anything. Not a poor old widow's worn-out farm and a poor old widow with it. I could have land and strangers," Ben said, "or I could have you and a home and spend the rest of my life being loved by the one person who saw me when the whole world rode past." He took her work-worn hands in his. "I know which a wise man chooses, Abigail. I'm asking you to let me stay, not to pay a debt. Because somewhere in these weeks I came to love you. And because I think we've both been alone about 11 years too long, and because the money in that saddlebag would buy 100 acres out west that wouldn't be worth one porch with you on it. Marry me. Let's put my 15 years into this place, into us, and neither of us be lonely another day." Abigail Dyer, the invisible widow, the woman the world forgot, the only soul in the county who stopped, let herself believe it and let 11 years of loneliness fall away. And said yes. They married that summer, and Ben Quaid's hard-won 15 years went not into a stranger's land out west, but into Abigail's little place at the edge of the Sweetwater, and the two of them built it up together, into something neither could have built alone, a real home, full at last of the love they'd each had no one to give for so long. And the town of Antelope, which had ridden past a dying man, and never given a thought to the lonely widow at the edge of things, watched the two overlooked souls make a good and happy life together, and more than a few of the respectable folks who'd ridden past that day on the Lodgepole Road found, when they remembered it, that they could not quite meet Abigail Dyer's eyes. She never threw it at them, that was not her way. But she knew, and Ben knew, the truth of what had happened on that road, and they told it in their old age, to anyone who'd listen. Everybody rode past him, Abigail would say, with Ben hale and white-haired beside her decades on. Good folks, church-going folks, saw a hurt man in a ditch and decided it was somebody else's trouble and rode on by. And I'll tell you, I wasn't braver than them, or better. I was just lonely enough, and I'd been overlooked enough myself that I couldn't bear to do to another soul what the world had been doing to me for 11 years. So I stopped. She'd squeeze his hand, and stopping for that stranger in the ditch turned out to be the thing that saved my whole life, not just his. We were both of us left for dead, in our way, him on the road and me in that empty house, and we pulled each other out. She'd smile. So if you ever come up on somebody the whole world's decided to ride past, you stop. You never know. The life you save when you stop for someone nobody else will may just turn out to be your own.